did I hear this right? Feeling unsafe can be a traumatic event. I was wondering, does trauma have to be connected to abuse, or can it also be connected to unsafe feelings? As an example, can premarital sex be a traumatic event if it isn't abuse?
Yeah, totally. Awesome question. Great question. Trying to understand, what is trauma, what constitutes trauma. There's, our understanding of trauma has developed quite a bit and has moved beyond some of the circumstantial kind of structures that we used to think about trauma within, right? That trauma was about this kind of event or that event or that event, whether natural disaster trauma or war kind of trauma or kind of violence trauma. And all of those are different circumstances and contexts that can create trauma. But what makes something traumatic is really a combination of things that are happening internally inside a person, which is why two people can experience the same instance and one can experience it traumatically and another doesn't experience it traumatically. That the circumstances in and of themselves aren't what determine whether or not something is experienced traumatically. It's really what's happening inside the person, and it's how the brain responds to the situation. That trauma changes the brain. It impacts a person's brain. And so there's a physiological structural shift that happens inside a human being when they experience something traumatically. And that's what constitutes trauma. That's what it is that makes it traumatic. And one of the components of that is the overwhelming nature of something. When something is experienced that's more than the system can handle, right? That the brain, the body doesn't know how to process what's taking place. And that kind of overload is part of what causes it to be traumatic. Part of it is aloneness, right? That we as humans are meant to process through hard things in relationship. Or we co-regulate is kind of the neurological terminology for how human beings move through tough stuff. Scriptures call it bearing one another's burdens. But the neurologists that have recognized it in the brain, say it as we co-regulate as human beings. And so when we face things that are intolerable alone, we can tolerate them in relationship, and when we're not alone with them, that we can handle really hard, difficult things. But when faced with really hard, difficult things in isolation, we can't handle them. Our system can't handle them. It's overwhelming to us. It's traumatic to us in our experience. Fear oftentimes is a component of things that are traumatic. And that's either, for example, people can have a traumatic response to what is perceived as a near-death experience, even if they were in no real physical danger at all. If the perception of the situation is such that they are believe that there's a threat of death that's there, the fear is overwhelming in a way that can cause a traumatic response within the body.
Right. Well, they even said, in the question that unsafe feeling, and I think I would attribute, an unsafe feeling to being fearful.
Correct. Totally. Right. And so shame is also kind of components of that. So to specifically kind of think about the example that is in the question, it is not uncommon for us to see folks, usually women, who have kind of a traumatic response to kind of sexual experiences that they had in dating or engaged, right? And some of the ways that that looks and takes form is in a kind of a internal distress that they experience around maybe the violation of their values in some way, and where maybe a gal's in a rock and a hard place in terms of, on the one hand, they have their values that are important to them and what they're wanting to do with their body and what they're wanting to do with life and relationship. And on the other hand, they have a significant attachment in a dating relationship, and they feel kind of pulled between those two factors of maybe feeling a relational pressure or stress to being more sexually engaged than their values kind of allow for. But having the importance and the significance of that relationship and the threat of loss within that relationship, and kind of creates this kind of tension of I can't win either way that I go. And there's either the feeling of rejection and loss in significant relationship, or the feeling of shame and guilt around violating one's own values by going further than they feel comfortable doing. And then there can be this added layer of shame of I can't talk about it with him, and I can't talk about it with my community, and so I'm alone with it. So I have this really heavy and overwhelming thing that's experienced in isolation rather than held together in relationship. And the combination of that internal distress, that attachment, fear of loss, the isolation that's a part of it, can very much cause it to be a traumatic kind of experience in such a way that then causes that emotion to be associated with one's sexuality, that the sexuality becomes a trigger for that kind of traumatic experience, that then being engaged sexually or engaging sexually then creates a sense of shame or distress that's related to that experience or experiences that they've had. So that would just be kind of one example. Other examples, did you have a thought on that, Tori?
Well, I mean, I just think that specifically, as you're talking about it, I see a lot of myself in that story,
Mm-hmm.
and things that I've experienced in my own life, and trauma that I've experienced and kind of had to work through in my own marriage as far as, sexual trauma goes. And I just see a lot of myself in that specific example. And so just, I guess, speaking from having experienced that, yes, I mean, I definitely see myself in that, in having experienced trauma that kind of carries, into your future relationships. And you kind of start to hold on to that one feeling that you had in that traumatic event. And, I could be in a perfectly healthy, marriage relationship, but those feelings still kind of well up inside of me because they're still there, there's still some
Totally.
trauma there.
Totally. Absolutely. Other events that you see sometimes that, people, maybe don't classify or think about is unwanted attention sorts. That there's, as a young woman, sometimes we'll have clients that, or maybe what we think of as like early bloomers or such, right? That maybe there's secondary sexual characteristics, breasts, that sort of thing, curves, going to start to show up ahead of their peers. And so they're the curvier kind of girl in their class. And maybe there's all of this attention given to their body that's not solicited, not wanted.
Right. Well, and also just if you're young and you're experiencing things like that, I mean, sometimes you're just not mentally, emotionally ready for that. I mean, sometimes your body has gotten to a point where your mind and spirit like haven't caught up yet.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so suddenly, maybe as a 13-year-old, 12, 13-year-old girl, you're getting attention from adult males or much older kinds of males that are, responding to or reacting to those secondary sexual characteristics or features that are developing in a way that can leave you feeling really uncomfortable around your body and the attention that it garners and attracts, and self-conscious around that, anxious around that. And suddenly my body, and specifically my body being sexual in nature, feels unsafe. Like it draws this attention that I don't want. It doesn't feel good and is anxiety producing and maybe even scary at times. and that gets associated with the body and with one's sexual experience, and it gets paired together in a way that is traumatic, and can carry forward, through, as through development and into adulthood and into married life, that angst and anxiety and negative emotional experience gets paired with those things.
Yeah, it's so interesting to have words put to it, because I don't think that I have necessarily experienced that, but I've heard friends, and I remember having conversations with friends, even at that young kind of 11, 12, 13-year-old age, with those kinds of feelings, and to hear you kind of put words to it. I think that a lot of women now, can relate to having that experience. Honestly, I think that it does happen. I think it's very common.
Absolutely. And because we don't have language to put around it, because a lot of times we're not talking about it, we don't recognize or label how that can be impactful. And so it's not really talked about, and therefore it's experienced in isolation and again alone, in a way that doesn't allow an individual to work through those experiences and um, to integrate that into their experience in a way that doesn't result in kind of a traumatic outflow.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think even, what you said about there not being, really a language for it, and not really a conversation for it, I think that is, completely valid, that a lot of women just sort of, suffer in silence in a way, just sort of take it, and, don't even realize maybe that other girls, other women are feeling the exact same emotions.
Right, absolutely. And this can happen within marriage also. It can happen in older gals and in relationship. Sometimes, again, one of those things that we don't talk about or isn't shared, or there's confusion around, and or is experienced in isolation, is you can have an experience as an adult woman in your marriage where you don't feel open to or up to kind of engaging sexually for one reason or another, but feel guilt or shame or pressure that it's my duty, kind of with as a wife, to be sexually available, and so feel unable to say no, unable to kind of communicate where you're not being open to an experience, and feel kind of violated within the marital relationship around that, whether or not that's ever communicated out loud or not, with your partner, in a way that can feel very violating internally and create a pairing experience between one's sexuality and their spouse, and sexual experience that can be traumatic and get in the way of being able to relax and enjoy and feel positive about sexual experiences together and in the future. So there's a lot of different experiences, encounters that can happen, whether they be uh, progressive over time, like a chronic kind of exposure, like having unwanted attention to your body, or a a moment or instance, walking down the hall and having someone grab your butt or grab your body in some way, and an unwanted physical kind of violation of the body that can leave one feeling unsafe and violated in a way that's can be a very emotionally traumatic thing, or dating relationships or marital relationships. Point being that there's a lot of different experiences that fall outside of what we think of traditionally as trauma, like a rape experience or childhood sexual abuse. We go, okay, those create traumatic experience. And so if you're a woman who's having the response, like if you're listening to Tisha's talk kind of in our Q&A and My Counselor Live a couple of weeks ago, and going, my experience kind of reflects what you're describing in terms of trauma, but I didn't have childhood sexual abuse. I wasn't raped. And so why in the world would I be having these experiences? It can be really confusing
Yeah, and almost like you start invalidating yourself. Like, well, no, there's no way that like that's what this is. There are things that are, more worth that word than what I've experienced. So I think you start to kind of that shame part, and you start to sort of shame yourself and invalidate what you've experienced.
Yeah, and that shame can come in and say, hey, you're making too big a deal of something. And the point of recognizing trauma symptomology isn't about making something a bigger deal than it is. It's about just recognizing reality as you experience it. Like your body will tell you if you're having a traumatic response, and you can feel that in the experiences that you're having in your life. And you can like it or not like it or wish it was or wasn't, that it just is what it is. You are experiencing what you're experiencing, and by naming it, it gives us a pathway for finding healing in those things that can allow us to integrate those experiences into the narrative of our life and allow us to be free of the negative effects of those unintegrated experiences.
Yeah, yeah. So, you mentioned a few things, naming it, coming out of that isolation and really,
Mhm.
finding community and having conversations about it. What else as a licensed counselor would you recommend someone do if they're experiencing these kinds of traumas, and maybe don't have a word for it, don't know how to process it or really call it what it is?
Yeah, good question. So you really identified in as we're talking some of the big pieces that are the starting place. The first is an attunement to one's own experience and just listening to your body and recognizing when something doesn't feel good, something doesn't feel right, where there's kind of a pullback, or an experience that you're having that's confusing to you. Why do I find myself pulling away from my spouse and when they're trying to be tender and move towards me? What's that about? What's happening for me? Or as we're connecting sexually, why do I feel disgust, or why do I feel anxiety or discomfort in some reason? What's that about? Noticing it, being curious about it, not being judgmental of it. I mean, like, I shouldn't feel this, I shouldn't feel that, it's dumb that I feel this, it's ridiculous, or what other kinds of shaming and judging messages that we can kind of play in our head. But instead responding to it with curiosity of going, what is this about? I don't know what it is. I don't like it. It doesn't feel good, but I want to understand it and what's happening. Knowing that your experience tells a story. You may not know what the story is that it's telling, but it's telling a story that matters. We want to be able to listen to that and validate that. The next piece is bringing a safe person into the circle with us around that, that can bear that with us, that can bear witness to it and can hold it with us and give us space in the relationship to explore it with them. Maybe that's our spouse, maybe that's a girlfriend, maybe that's a trusted mentor of some sort, someone who can hold it with us, process it with us, listen, not be judgmental, and allow space for it. Sometimes that in of itself is enough to bring healing to those things. If we can just bring them out into the light and connect with another person around them, that shows the care for those things that it needs in order to help it resolve and integrate into our experience. At other times, there's a need to go deeper than that, and you may need to connect with a counselor who can help guide you through a process of identifying what are the different pieces here and can engage some of the different techniques that we know and treatment processes that we know to be able to identify and integrate traumatic experience into our narrative in a way that enables it to be time stamped and part of our past instead of something that lives in the present with us. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's how you get started.
yeah, no, that's great. That's great advice. Hopefully, if you're watching this and are kind of, questioning your own experiences, hopefully this was able to give you some clarity. So,
Yeah, thanks
thank
for
you
the
so much,
question.
Josh. Yeah.
That there's so many gals that I have worked with over the years who come in and they share their experience and they're really confused by it. And like, I haven't had this as part of my story, and I haven't had this as part of my story. And so I don't understand why I'm having these experiences. And so just you being willing to wrap voice around that, and undoubtedly has helped lots of other gals that are listening to this recognize part of their own experience in that. So I really appreciate that question.